My name is Lorena. The silence inside the Walton estate was not peaceful, it was predatory. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against the high vaulted ceilings and settled into the plush, imported carpets like a layer of invisible dust. For Lorena, the sprawling mansion located in the most exclusive district of the city had never been a home. It was a museum of cold marble and colder hearts, a place where she was less of a resident and more of an unwanted exhibit that had overstayed its welcome. Outside, the winter wind battered the manicured gardens, stripping the trees bare, mirroring the bleak desolation that defined her existence within these walls. Lorena sat in the nursery, a room tucked away in the west wing, as far removed from the master suite as architecture would allow. The room was warm, illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a star, the only source of warmth in the entire house. In the center of the room sat Amira, her 5-year-old daughter. Amira was strapped into her specialized wheelchair, her head lolling slightly to the side, her large, expressive eyes tracking the movement of a mobile spinning slowly above her. To the outside world, and specifically to the Walton family, Amira was a tragedy. She was a nonverbal, immobile child who required constant care, a deviation from the perfection the Waltons demanded. But to Lorena, she was the sun, the moon, and the stars. Lorena gently wiped a trickle of drool from Amira's chin with a muslin cloth, her touch feather light. She hummed a soft melody, a lullaby she had made up years ago when the silence of the house became too loud to bear. Every movement she made was an act of defiance against the atmosphere of the house. The staff, trained to be invisible yet omnipresent, treated Lorena with a disdain that trickled down from their masters. Earlier that day, when Lorena had asked the head housekeeper for extra blankets for Amira's room due to the drafty windows, the woman had merely sniffed, stating that the heating system was optimized for the comfort of the residents, implying that Amira's comfort was a waste of resources. The blankets never came. Lorena had spent the afternoon layering her own coats over her daughter's legs. The sound of a heavy car engine growling up the driveway shattered the quiet. Lorena's stomach tightened, a familiar knot of dread forming at the base of her throat. It was late, past midnight, which meant John was home. And judging by the aggressive way the car door slammed shut, echoing through the cavernous entrance hall 3 floors down, he was not in a good mood. John Walton was the golden boy of the city's political scene, a man groomed from birth to take over his father's empire and eventually run for Senate. He was charming, handsome, and ruthless in the boardroom. But inside the walls of his home, the mask fell away, revealing a hollow, bitter man consumed by his own vanity. He had not touched Lorena in years, and he had not looked at Amira, really looked at her, since the day the doctors confirmed her condition would be permanent. To him, Amira was not a daughter, she was a glitch in his genetic code, a public relations nightmare that he had to hide away while he campaigned on family values. Lorena heard the heavy footsteps ascending the grand staircase. They were uneven, stumbling slightly, accompanied by the low, angry murmur of voices. It wasn't just John, his father was with him. The patriarch, Mr. Walton, was a man whose disapproval felt like a physical blow. He viewed Lorena not as a daughter-in-law, but as a failed investment. She had been brought into the family to breed strong, capable heirs. In his eyes, she had delivered a broken product. The footsteps stopped outside the nursery door. Lorena held her breath, her hand instinctively resting protectively on Amira's shoulder. The door handle turned, but the door didn't open immediately. There was a hesitation, a muttering of hushed, venomous words, before the oak slab was shoved open. John stood in the doorway, swaying slightly. The stench of aged scotch and stale cigar smoke rolled off him in waves, polluting the clean, powdery scent of the nursery. His tie was undone, his expensive suit rumpled. Behind him stood his father, leaning on his cane, his face a mask of stone-cold disappointment. Neither of them looked at Lorena. Their eyes went straight to the wheelchair in the center of the room. John let out a dry, humorless laugh. He gestured vaguely toward Amira with a glass he was still clutching in his hand. He slurred his words, speaking to his father as if Lorena weren't even in the room. He questioned aloud why he was cursed to come home to a hospital ward instead of a legacy. He lamented the fact that his colleagues were celebrating their son's acceptance into prep schools and sports teams, while he was saddled with a child who would never speak his name, never carry the Walton banner, and never offer him a return on his investment. Lorena stood up, placing her body between the men and her daughter. She kept her head down, a learned behavior of survival. Eye contact only fueled their rage. She focused on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, counting the threads to keep herself from screaming. She knew that any defense she mounted would be twisted against her. If she spoke of love, they would call her delusional. If she spoke of duty, they would laugh at her incompetence. The elder Walton stepped forward, the tap of his cane on the floorboard sounding like a judge's gavel. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that carried more weight than any scream. He addressed John, ignoring Lorena entirely, stating that the situation had become untenable. He spoke of the upcoming election cycle, of the need for a pristine image. He called Amira a liability, a word that hung in the air, stripping the child of her humanity and reducing her to a line item on a balance sheet that needed to be erased. He reminded John that a man who could not produce a viable heir was seen as weak by the electorate, and the Walton family did not tolerate weakness. John's gaze finally drifted to Lorena. There was no love in his eyes, not even the residual warmth of a past affection. There was only resentment. He looked at her as if she were a parasite that had attached itself to his life, draining him of his potential. He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the smell of alcohol overpowering. He didn't hit her, he was too careful about bruises that might show in photos, but his words were designed to eviscerate. He leaned in close to her ear and whispered that he was tired. He was tired of the pitying looks from his friends, tired of the hushed whispers at the country club, and tired of coming home to a wife who was nothing more than a nursemaid to a mistake. He told her that he had met with his lawyers earlier that day. The words, irreconcilable differences, were thrown at her like stones. But the true cruelty came next. He told her that he had already begun the process of correcting his path. He mentioned that a man of his stature deserved a woman who could give him what he needed, implying that Lorena was biologically incapable of producing the perfection he required. Lorena felt the blood drain from her face, but she remained statue still. This was the weaponization of her motherhood. They were using Amira's existence, the very thing Lorena cherished most, as the justification for discarding her. They made her feel that her womb was a graveyard, that she was fundamentally broken. The gaslighting was so absolute, so ingrained in the daily rhythm of their lives, that a small, treacherous part of her mind whispered that maybe they were right. Maybe she was the failure. John turned away, disgusted by her silence, or perhaps bored by her lack of reaction. He stumbled back toward the door, taking a final swig of his drink. He threw one last look over his shoulder, not at Lorena, but at Amira, who was happily watching the mobile, oblivious to the hatred directed at her. John sneered, muttering that it was a waste of a room with a view, before walking out into the hallway. The elder Walton lingered for a moment longer. He looked at Lorena with eyes devoid of empathy. He told her simply to have her affairs in order, for changes were coming swiftly. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and followed his son, the sound of his cane fading down the corridor. Lorena waited until she heard the distant slam of the master bedroom door before she allowed herself to exhale. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor beside the wheelchair. The luxury of the room felt mocking now. The expensive toys John bought only for photo opportunities, the high-end medical equipment, it was all a stage set for a play she no longer had a role in. She reached up and took Amira's small hand in hers. The child's fingers curled around Lorena's thumb, a reflex that felt like a lifeline. Tears finally spilled over, hot and silent, tracking through the makeup she hadn't yet washed off, the makeup she wore like armor to hide the dark circles of exhaustion. They wanted her gone. The realization wasn't a surprise, but the finality of it was terrifying. She had no money of her own, the prenuptial agreement she had signed at 22, blinded by what she thought was love, left her with nothing if she was the one to leave. But if they cast her out? She would be destitute. And Amira, what would happen to Amira? The Waltons would never pay for the specialized care she needed if Lorena was out of the picture. They would institutionalize her, hide her away in some dark corner of the state system to be forgotten, erasing the stain on their reputation. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her despair. She wasn't just losing a husband, she was facing a war for her daughter's survival. She looked around the gilded prison that had been her home for 6 years. Every silk curtain and gold-leafed frame seemed to sneer at her poverty. She was a guest who was about to be evicted, a mother whose child was deemed a burden. But as she looked at Amira's peaceful face, a spark of something else ignited beneath the fear. It was a primal, fierce heat. They could insult her, they could divorce her, and they could strip her of every jewel and dress. But they would not erase her daughter. Lorena kissed Amira's knuckles, wiping her tears. She didn't know how she would survive the coming storm. She didn't know about the secrets buried in her medical files, or the arrival of a doctor who would change everything. She only knew that the coldness of the Walton house had finally frozen her heart against them. Tonight, she was a victim in a gilded cage. But as the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, Lorena silently vowed that if they threw her to the wolves, she would return leading the pack. She stood up, locked the nursery door from the inside, a futile gesture, perhaps, but a symbolic one, and prepared to keep watch through the long, dark night. The morning sun that filtered through the high, arched windows of the Walton estate offered no real warmth, casting instead long, skeletal shadows across the polished herringbone floors of the drawing room. Lorena sat on the edge of a velvet settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light. The house was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath, the kind that precedes a catastrophe. She had spent the early hours of the morning bathing Amira, dressing her in a soft knit sweater, and settling her into her chair by the garden window. The routine was her anchor, the only thing that kept the creeping panic of the previous night at bay. But the air in the house had changed. The staff moved with averted eyes, their footsteps hushed and hurried, carrying with them the distinct, nervous energy of people who knew a secret they were terrified to speak. Lorena's tea had gone cold on the low mahogany table in front of her. She hadn't taken a sip. Her stomach was a knot of nausea that had tightened the moment she heard the gravel crunch under tires in the driveway. It wasn't the delivery van, nor was it the housekeeper's arrival. It was a sleek, purring engine, a luxury sedan that signaled an arrival of consequence. She had remained seated, paralyzed by a premonition that to stand up and look out the window would be to invite the disaster in. But she didn't have to look. The heavy front doors opened without the chime of the doorbell, indicating that whoever was entering had a key, or was being ushered in by a husband who no longer felt the need to knock on the door of his own betrayal. Voices drifted from the foyer. One was John's, booming, confident, stripped of the drunken slur from the night before. He sounded revitalized, possessing the swagger of a man who had just closed the deal of a lifetime. The other voice was lighter, feminine, and laced with a sugary affectation that made Lorena's skin crawl. It was a laugh that sounded like breaking glass, sharp and performative. Lorena knew that voice. She had heard it at charity galas and in the background of John's business calls for months, a phantom frequency that she had tried desperately to tune out. Now, that frequency was broadcasting live in her hallway. When they entered the drawing room, the visual impact was a physical blow. John walked in first, wearing a fresh, tailored suit that screamed power and vitality. He looked younger, lighter, as if the burden of his failed family had already been lifted from his shoulders. But it was the woman on his arm who sucked the oxygen from the room. Emma. She was everything Lorena felt she was not, vibrant, impeccably groomed, and radiating a predatory sort of health. Her blonde hair was a cascade of perfect waves, her dress a designer piece that cost more than the medical equipment Lorena had fought to get for Amira. She didn't walk, she sauntered, her hand resting possessively on the crook of John's arm, her eyes scanning the room not as a guest, but as an appraiser. Lorena stood up, her legs trembling slightly beneath her long skirt. She didn't speak. There were no words for a moment like this, no etiquette book that covered the arrival of a mistress into the marital home while the wife was still standing in it. John didn't look shameful, he looked vindicated. He gestured for Emma to sit, offering her the wingback chair that had been his mother's favorite, a symbolic dethroning that was not lost on Lorena. Emma sank into the chair with a satisfied sigh, smoothing her skirt over her hips, her gaze locking onto Lorena with a look of mock sympathy that was far crueler than open hostility. John remained standing, positioning himself behind Emma like a guardian, or perhaps a proud owner displaying a prize. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or lies. The era of excuses was over. He cleared his throat, a sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room, and began to speak with a chilling matter-of-factness. He introduced Emma not as a colleague or a friend, but as the future of the Walton dynasty. He spoke of new beginnings and necessary evolutions, using the cold, corporate language of a boardroom restructuring to describe the dismantling of his family. Lorena watched his lips move, feeling a strange detachment, as if she were watching a play from the back row of a theater. He was talking about duty. He was talking about the Walton name, a legacy that stretched back 3 generations, built on steel and shipping and ruthless acquisition. He explained, with a complete lack of irony, that a man in his position had an obligation to the world, an obligation to reproduce his own greatness. He gestured toward the ceiling, toward the upper floors where Amira lay, and his face twisted into a mask of disdain. He didn't use Amira's name. He referred to her as the situation and the unfortunate outcome. He spoke of her disability as if it were a character flaw in Lorena, a failure of her biological duty to provide him with a pristine reflection of himself. Then came the turn of the knife. Emma shifted in her seat, her hand moving deliberately to rest on her flat stomach. The gesture was theatrical, designed to draw the eye, and it worked. Lorena's gaze dropped to Emma's midsection, and the air left her lungs. John smiled then, a genuine, terrifying smile of pride. He announced it before Emma could. He told Lorena that finally, nature had corrected its course. He declared that Emma was carrying his child, his son, he emphasized, though it was too early to know, his arrogance filling in the blanks of biology. This child, he claimed, would be the heir the Waltons had been denied. This child would be strong, capable, and worthy of the empire waiting for him. Emma chimed in then, her voice dripping with faux concern. She looked at Lorena and said she hoped there would be no hard feelings. She spoke about how difficult it must be for Lorena, raising a child with limitations, and how relief was actually a kindness John was offering her. She framed the divorce and the displacement as an act of mercy, suggesting that Lorena was too fragile, too consumed by the burden of Amira to be a proper wife to a man of John's stature. She patted her stomach again, a subconscious assertion of dominance. She was the fertile vessel, Lorena was the barren field. In the twisted logic of the Walton household, Emma was the hero of this story, stepping in to save the bloodline from extinction. Lorena felt a scream building in her chest, a raw, primal rejection of their narrative, but she swallowed it down. To scream would be to give them the reaction they wanted. It would paint her as the hysterical, unstable woman they were already claiming she was. She looked at John, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the man she had married 6 years ago. There was nothing. That man, if he had ever existed, had been consumed by the monster of his own ego. He was looking at Emma's stomach with a reverence he had never shown Amira. He was already planning the nursery, the schools, the photo ops. He was erasing his daughter in real time, replacing her with a hypothesis, a fetus that existed only as an idea of perfection. John continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. He told Lorena that the lawyers would be in touch regarding the timeline. He wanted this done quietly and quickly. He didn't want a scandal to mar the announcement of his real heir. He explicitly stated that Amira's presence was becoming a liability to his image. The sight of the wheelchair, the medical equipment, the nurses coming and going, it all projected weakness. He needed a home that projected vigor and future success. He looked around the room, his eyes sweeping over the family portraits, and said that he needed to sanitize the environment before the baby arrived. The word, sanitize, hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was talking about his daughter as if she were a contagion. The cruelty was absolute. It wasn't just that he was leaving her, it was that he was doing so with a moral superiority that was baffling. He believed he was the victim, trapped in a marriage with a broken child, and that his infidelity was a righteous act of survival. He framed his betrayal as a biological imperative. He looked at Lorena and told her that she should be grateful he had provided for her this long, considering she had failed in her one primary function. Lorena's hands unclenched in her lap. The numbness was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. She looked at Emma, who was now inspecting her manicured nails, bored with the conversation, secure in her victory. She looked at John, who was checking his watch, already moving on to the next appointment in his day. They were hollow. They were caricatures of human beings, filled with straw and gold dust, devoid of souls. Lorena stood up. The movement was sudden enough to startle John. He took a half-step back, perhaps expecting her to lunge at him or collapse in tears. She did neither. She smoothed the front of her dress, her face a mask of stone. She didn't acknowledge Emma. She didn't acknowledge the pregnancy. She looked John in the eye and spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but steady, cutting through the room's tension like a razor. She told him that he could have his house, his empire, and his legacy. She told him that he could sign whatever papers he wanted. But she warned him, a soft, terrifying warning, that the things he called burdens were often the only things that kept a man grounded, and that gravity had a way of claiming those who thought they could fly above it. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the drawing room, her back straight, her footsteps echoing on the parquet floor. She felt their eyes on her, confusing her dignity for defeat. She climbed the stairs, the sound of Emma's high-pitched laughter following her, a sound of triumph that grated on her nerves. When she reached the nursery, she closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Amira was still by the window, watching the birds in the garden. The sunlight caught the gold in her daughter's hair, creating a halo that the darkness of the house couldn't touch. Lorena walked over and knelt beside the wheelchair, burying her face in Amira's small, warm lap. The contrast was shattering. Downstairs, they were celebrating a theoretical child, a perfect heir built on a foundation of lies and adultery. Upstairs, the imperfect child sat in silence, radiating a pure, uncomplicated love that John was too blind to see. Lorena realized then that the betrayal wasn't just about another woman. It was about the erasure of Amira's worth. John hadn't just cheated on his wife, he had disowned his child's humanity. He had replaced a living, breathing soul with the promise of a trophy. As Lorena held her daughter, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, the sadness began to harden into something usable. They thought she was weak. They thought she was a discardable accessory. They had no idea that a mother protecting her child was the most dangerous force in nature. Let them have their victory lap, she thought, stroking Amira's hair. Let them toast to their real heir. The fall, when it came, would be all the more devastating for the height they were climbing to. The invitation had been a command, not a request. It was delivered on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold leaf edges, the calligraphy elegant and sharp as a knife. The annual Walton Charity Gala was the crowning jewel of the city's social calendar, a night where the elite gathered to pat themselves on the back for their philanthropy while drinking champagne that cost more than most families earned in a month. For Lorena, it had always been a performance of endurance, a night of forced smiles and shallow conversations. But tonight, as she stood before the full-length mirror in the guest wing she had been relegated to, she knew this wasn't just a party. It was a public execution. She smoothed the fabric of her gown, a modest, dark blue silk that she had chosen specifically to blend into the background. It was armor, not fashion. Beside her, Amira sat in her wheelchair, dressed in a soft velvet dress that matched the color of Lorena's eyes. Lorena had brushed Amira's hair until it shone like spun gold, placing a small ribbon to hold it back from her face. Amira looked like a doll, beautiful and fragile, her eyes wide with the confusion of being up past her bedtime. To Lorena, she was perfection. To the people waiting downstairs, she was the evidence of failure. The descent down the grand staircase was a gauntlet. The ballroom doors were thrown open, spilling light and sound into the foyer. The air smelled of expensive perfume, stargazer lilies, and the metallic tang of caviar. As Lorena pushed the wheelchair toward the entrance, she felt the physical weight of the atmosphere pressing against her chest. The hum of conversation didn't stop when she appeared, but the tenor of it changed. It shifted from the casual buzz of socialization to the sharp, sibilant hiss of gossip. Heads turned. Eyes narrowed. Fans were raised to cover mouths that whispered words Lorena didn't need to hear to understand. They knew. In this circle, secrets rotted faster than fruit, and the smell of the Walton scandal had already permeated the room. Lorena moved through the crowd, her head held high, her grip on the wheelchair handles white-knuckled. She was Moses parting a sea of silk and tuxedos, but unlike the biblical miracle, the path cleared for her was not one of reverence, but of repulsion. Guests stepped back, creating a wide berth around the wheelchair, as if Amira's condition were contagious. A woman Lorena had once considered a friend turned her back deliberately, engaging in a sudden, animated conversation with a waiter. A business partner of John stared openly at Amira, his expression a mixture of pity and distaste, before shaking his head and turning away. They were islands in a sea of hostility. Lorena navigated them toward a quiet corner near the heavy velvet drapes, hoping to wait out the obligatory hour before she could escape. But the Waltons had not orchestrated this evening for her to hide in the shadows. They needed her in the light. The music, a live string quartet playing Mozart, swelled and then faded into silence as a spoon tapped against a crystal flute. The sound was sharp, piercing the murmurs of the crowd. All eyes turned toward the raised dais at the far end of the ballroom. There, standing beneath the glittering chandelier, was the Walton triumvirate: John, looking flush with liquor and adrenaline; Emma, draped in a crimson gown that screamed for attention, her hand resting conspicuously on John's arm; and in the center, the patriarch, Mr. Walton. The elder Walton gripped the podium with hands that looked like claws. He didn't need a microphone, his voice projected with the authority of a man who owned the building and everyone in it. He began with the usual platitudes, thanking the donors, praising the city's resilience, and highlighting the family's contributions to medical advancement, a bitter irony that made bile rise in Lorena's throat. But the pleasantries were short-lived. The air in the room grew heavy, the temperature seeming to drop as his tone shifted from celebratory to solemn. He spoke of the future. He spoke of the Walton legacy, a 100-year-old tree that required pruning to ensure its survival. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the hundreds of faces before landing, with laser precision, on the corner where Lorena stood. The crowd followed his eyes. Like a spotlight, the collective attention of the room slammed into Lorena and Amira. There was nowhere to hide. Walton's voice became a growl. He announced that the family was entering a new era, one of strength and revitalization. He stated, with a calmness that was terrifying, that errors of the past were being corrected. He didn't use Lorena's name at first. He spoke in the abstract about the burden of genetic incompatibility and the financial drain of supporting non-viable branches of the family tree. He framed the dissolution of his son's marriage not as a tragedy, but as a necessary business decision, a corporate restructuring of the bloodline. Then, he pointed. A gnarled finger extended toward the wheelchair. He declared that while charity was a noble virtue for the poor, the Walton dynasty could not afford to harbor weakness within its own walls. He labeled the marriage a mistake, a lapse in judgment that had resulted in a defective return. The words hung in the air, gross and heavy. Defective. Burden. Stain. He was stripping Amira of her humanity in front of the city's most powerful people, reducing a 5-year-old girl to a manufacturing error that was being recalled. The cruelty was performative. John stood by, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the victimized prince who had been shackled to a broken promise. Emma beamed, her hands smoothing the fabric over her stomach, a visual promise of the correct heir to come. The crowd didn't gasp in horror. They didn't rush to defend the mother and child. They watched with a morbid fascination, a silent consensus that this was the natural order of things. In their world, weakness was the only true sin, and Walton was simply excommunicating the sinner. Lorena felt the blood drain from her extremities. The room spun slightly. She wanted to scream, to overturn the tables, to shatter the crystal glasses and slice the smug look off the old man's face. But she couldn't. Any outburst would only validate their narrative that she was unstable, hysterical, unfit. She was trapped in the center of the ballroom, the focal point of 1,000 judging eyes. She could hear the whispers now, no longer hushed. They were laughing. Not a raucous belly laugh, but a tittering, cruel sound, the sound of relief that they were not the ones being devoured. She looked down at Amira. The little girl was oblivious to the meaning of the words, but she sensed the tension. She whimpered, shifting uncomfortably in her chair, reaching up with a small, trembling hand toward her mother. Lorena took the hand, squeezing it gently. That touch was the only reality in a room full of illusions. It grounded her. It reminded her that the man on the stage was not a god, but a monster. And monsters, no matter how powerful, could be slain. Walton finished his speech by raising a toast to the future, a future that clearly did not include Lorena or her daughter. Glasses clinked. The sound was like the rattling of bones. John leaned down and kissed Emma, a public seal on their pact of erasure. The music started up again, a lively waltz, as if the destruction of a family was a festive occasion. Lorena didn't move immediately. To run would be to admit defeat. She stood there for a long, agonizing minute, forcing the nearest guests to look her in the eye. Most looked away, unable to hold her gaze. She wasn't crying. Her face was a mask of cold porcelain. Inside, however, the last remnants of her love for John, the last shreds of her respect for this society, were burning away. In their place, a cold, hard diamond of hatred was forming. She realized then that this humiliation was necessary. It was the fire that cauterized the wound. If she had left quietly, she might have mourned the loss of this life. But now? Now she saw it for what it was, a cesspool wrapped in silk. They had called her daughter a defect. They had called her a burden. They had laughed while signing her eviction notice from their world. Lorena slowly turned the wheelchair. She didn't rush. She walked with a deliberate, regal slowness toward the exit, the wheels of the chair cutting a path through the heavy velvet of the crowd's indifference. She kept her head high, her eyes fixed on the double doors that led to the cold night air. She didn't look back at the dais. She didn't look back at the husband who was already drinking to forget her, or the father-in-law who thought he had just won. As the doors closed behind her, muting the music and the laughter, Lorena stopped in the empty, marble hallway. She knelt in front of Amira, fixing the ribbon in her hair. She whispered a promise into the silence, a vow that the next time she entered a room like that, they wouldn't be laughing. They would be trembling. The shame they had tried to dump on her tonight was not hers to keep. It was alone. And she would return it to them, with interest. The library of the Walton estate was a mausoleum of masculine ambition, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves of unread leather-bound books and smelling permanently of aged tobacco and lemon polish. It was a space designed to intimidate, to make anyone standing on the other side of the massive mahogany desk feel small and insignificant. Lorena stood there now, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide the tremor that had started in her fingers and worked its way up to her shoulders. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the afternoon sun, casting the room in a perpetual, murky twilight that matched the mood of the impending execution. John sat behind the desk, leaning back in his high-backed leather chair, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the banker's lamp. He looked every inch the lord of the manor, a man who had manipulated his world until it bent to his will. Beside him, perched on the edge of the desk with a casual disrespect for the sanctity of the workspace, was Emma. She swirled a glass of sparkling water, the ice clinking softly, a sound that grated on Lorena's nerves like a nail on a chalkboard. They were a tableau of triumph, the king and his new queen, waiting for the peasant to accept her exile. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. John didn't speak immediately. He seemed to be savoring the moment, prolonging Lorena's discomfort as if it were a fine wine. He picked up a thick manila envelope from the desk, weighing it in his hand. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood was loud in the quiet room. These were the documents that would legally sever Lorena from the Walton name, from the house, and from the life she had tried so hard to build. They were the tangible proof of her failure in their eyes. Lorena waited for him to slide the envelope across the desk, to offer her a pen, to conduct this final transaction with at least a shred of dignity. But John had no interest in dignity. He had an audience in Emma, and he intended to perform. With a flick of his wrist, he didn't hand the papers to her, he tossed them. The envelope spun through the air, hitting Lorena's chest before fluttering to the floor, spilling its contents across the Persian rug. The white pages fanned out like the feathers of a dead bird at her feet. John laughed. It was a low, guttural sound, devoid of humor but full of malice. He watched her reaction, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. He didn't apologize. He didn't act as if it were an accident. He simply leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and gestured to the floor. The message was clear: this is where you belong. On your knees. Lorena stared at the scattered papers. The bold legal font screamed up at her: dissolution of marriage, custody arrangement, non-disclosure agreement. Every clause was a shackle being removed, every signature line a door slamming shut. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame that burned hotter than fire. She knew she had to bend down and pick them up. She knew that to retrieve her freedom, she had to physically lower herself before them. It was a calculated humiliation, a final exertion of dominance before he cast her aside. As Lorena slowly crouched down to gather the documents, her movements stiff and mechanical, Emma's voice cut through the air. It was light, conversational, the tone one might use to discuss the weather or a dinner menu, which made the words all the more venomous. She remarked to John, loud enough for Lorena to hear, that it was truly a mercy they were doing this. She looked down at Lorena, her gaze traveling over her prone form with a mixture of pity and disgust. She called Lorena a failed incubator, a vessel that had proven itself incapable of holding the precious cargo of the Walton legacy. She mused aloud that in nature, the weak were culled to protect the herd, and that really, John was just following the laws of biology. The insult landed with the weight of a physical blow. Failed incubator. It reduced Lorena's entire existence, her motherhood, her love, and her sacrifice, to a biological malfunction. It stripped Amira of her personhood, reducing the child to a bad batch in a factory line. Lorena froze, her hand hovering over a page detailed with the meager settlement offer. The cruelty was so precise, so targeted, that it took her breath away. They weren't just divorcing her, they were attempting to erase her identity as a woman and a mother. John chuckled, agreeing with Emma, adding that he should have read the user manual more carefully before investing. He joked that he was trading in a lemon for a luxury model. The laughter that followed was a duet of depravity, bouncing off the walls of the library, filling the space with a toxic sludge that made it hard to breathe. Lorena gathered the papers, her fingers brushing against the cold, rough wool of the rug. She didn't look up. She couldn't. If she looked at them now, she would either collapse or kill them, and neither option would save Amira. Amira. The name was a mantra in her mind. Every insult they hurled, every laugh that echoed in the room, was a reminder of why she had to sign. The air in this house was poison. It was a slow-acting toxin that was killing her spirit and would eventually destroy her daughter. John and his father would never love Amira, they would hide her, neglect her, or worse, institutionalize her to clear the path for Emma's perfect child. She had to get Amira out. If the price of her daughter's safety was her own humiliation, she would pay it. She would pay it 1,000 times over. She would crawl through glass if it meant carrying Amira to a place where she was seen as a child, not a defect. Lorena stood up, the papers clutched in her hand. She placed them on the edge of the desk, smoothing out the creases with a deliberate slowness. She didn't sit in the guest chair. She remained standing, forcing John to look up at her, if only slightly. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The time for tears had passed in the nursery the night before. Now, she was operating on a cold, hard instinct for survival. She reached for the heavy fountain pen that sat in its marble holder on the desk. It was cold metal, heavy in her hand. It was the same pen John had used to sign the merger deals that made him millions, the same pen he used to write checks to his mistress. Now, it would be the instrument of her liberation. John watched her, his smile faltering slightly at her lack of reaction. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to plead for a better settlement, to cry about the injustice of it all, to give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. But Lorena gave him nothing. Her face was a mask of marble, pale and impenetrable. She flipped to the last page, the paper crinkling in the silence. She read the terms one last time. They were draconian. She would leave with almost nothing, a small stipend that would barely cover a modest apartment, let alone Amira's medical bills. She would have to fight for every scrap. But the clause that mattered most was there, full physical and legal custody of the minor child, Amira Walton, to be granted to the mother. John had relinquished his rights easily, eager to wash his hands of the burden. He didn't want visitation. He didn't want holidays. He wanted a clean slate. He had no idea he was handing her the only thing of value in the entire estate. Lorena uncapped the pen. The ink was black, permanent. She positioned the nib over the signature line. Her hand trembled, not from fear of him, but from the magnitude of the moment. Once she signed, she was alone. No safety net, no resources, just her and Amira against the world. But as she looked at the signature line, she saw Amira's face. She saw the way her daughter's eyes lit up when she sang to her. She saw the potential that only she believed in. Emma leaned forward, impatient, tapping her manicured nails on the glass of water. She urged Lorena to hurry up, stating that they had a celebration dinner to attend and didn't want the past lingering in the doorway. She called Lorena a loose end that needed to be tied off. Lorena pressed the pen to the paper. The scratch of the nib was loud, a sound of tearing fabric. She wrote her name. Lorena. She didn't write Walton. She signed her maiden name, a reclamation of the self she had lost in this house. It was an act of defiance that went unnoticed by the two narcissists across the desk, but it rang like a bell in her own soul. She signed the second copy. Then the third. With each signature, the invisible chains that bound her to the toxicity of the Walton family loosened. She was signing away her financial security, yes, but she was buying her soul back. She was buying Amira's future. John reached for the papers the moment she lifted the pen, snatching them away as if afraid she might change her mind. He scanned the signatures, a smirk spreading across his face. He looked at Emma and winked, a gesture of conspiratorial victory. He told Lorena that she was free to go, dismissing her like a servant who had finished a task. He told her to take the girl and be out by the morning. He laughed again, saying he would need the nursery for the nursery designers coming next week. Lorena capped the pen and placed it gently back in the holder. She looked at John, then at Emma. They were celebrating a victory that was built on sand. They thought they had stripped her of everything, but they had only stripped her of the things that didn't matter. They were left with their money, their hollow prestige, and their lies. She was leaving with the truth. She turned to leave, the sound of her own heartbeat deafening in her ears. She hadn't said a word during the entire encounter. Her silence was her shield. But as she reached for the door handle, the heavy oak vibration under her palm, she felt a shift in the air. The atmosphere in the hallway beyond was charged, electric. The sound of the front door opening downstairs drifted up, followed by the authoritative murmur of voices that didn't belong to the staff. Lorena paused. She didn't know it yet, but the ink on the divorce papers was barely dry, and the universe was already moving to balance the scales. She opened the door, stepping out of the library and away from the laughter of her ex-husband, walking straight into the path of the man who would turn their laughter into screams. The failed incubator was about to be vindicated, and the burden was about to become the hammer that shattered the Walton glass house. She took a breath, steeled herself, and walked toward the stairs, where destiny, in the form of a doctor, was waiting. The ink on the divorce papers was still wet, a glistening black line that marked the end of an era and the beginning of Lorena's exile. The library, with its suffocating scent of old paper and male ego, felt like a vacuum where all hope had been sucked out, leaving only the stale air of John's triumph. Lorena had turned toward the heavy double doors, her hand reaching for the brass handle, desperate to escape the toxic gravity of the room. She wanted to run to the nursery, to grab Amira, and to flee this house before the walls finally closed in on them completely. But the universe, it seemed, was not quite done with the Walton family yet. Before her fingers could graze the cold metal, the doors exploded inward. It wasn't a polite entrance. It wasn't the tentative knock of a servant or the hesitant approach of a secretary. The heavy oak slabs, thick enough to stop a bullet, swung open with a violence that slammed them against the inner walls, the sound cracking through the library like a gunshot. The vibration rattled the crystal decanters on the side table and sent a shockwave through the stagnant air. Lorena stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat. Instinctively, she crossed her arms over her chest, a physical barrier against whatever fresh hell was being unleashed. John, who had been busy sliding the signed papers into a folder with the smug satisfaction of a cat that had finally cornered the mouse, jumped in his seat. The sudden noise shattered his composure, his pen skittering across the mahogany desk. Emma let out a sharp, undignified yelp, spilling her water onto the expensive rug, her mask of bored superiority instantly replaced by alarm. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh light of the hallway chandelier, stood a figure that commanded instant recognition and immediate fear. Dr. Alastair Smith was not merely a doctor, he was an institution. In the world of high-stakes genetics and elite medicine, his name was whispered with a reverence usually reserved for religious figures or heads of state. He was the man billionaires called when nature failed them, the keeper of secrets for the city's most powerful dynasties. He was tall, his posture unyielding, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than the car Lorena would likely be driving away in. His silver hair was swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite, his expression unreadable, his eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses sharp enough to dissect a soul. He stood there, breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from a suppressed, volcanic rage. In his hand, he gripped a leather medical attaché case with white-knuckled intensity. He ignored the sputtering protests of the butler who had clearly failed to stop him, stepping over the threshold and into the library as if he owned the very ground beneath his feet. John recovered first. His shock morphed quickly into annoyance, and then, realizing who it was, into a slick, predatory delight. He stood up, smoothing his jacket, his smile returning with double the voltage. In John's twisted narrative, the doctor's arrival was not an intrusion, it was a divine intervention. He assumed, with the breathtaking arrogance of a man who has never been told no, that Dr. Smith was there for him. He believed the doctor had come to deliver the final piece of the puzzle, the medical confirmation that Amira was, indeed, a lost cause. John rounded the desk, arms spread wide in a gesture of welcoming that felt more like a performance for an unseen audience. He greeted the doctor with a booming voice, acting as though they were old friends meeting at a club rather than in the wreckage of a marriage. He apologized for the dramatic entrance but quickly pivoted, framing the doctor's presence as serendipitous. He looked at Lorena, his eyes gleaming with malice, and then back at the doctor, stating that his timing was impeccable. He assumed Dr. Smith had brought the final genetic reports, the proof that the Walton bloodline had been polluted by Lorena's inferior biology. He wanted the science to back up his cruelty. He wanted a medical stamp of approval on his divorce. Emma, recovering her poise, leaned back against the desk, eyeing the doctor with a mixture of curiosity and flirtation. To her, he was just another powerful man in John's orbit, another potential ally in her ascent to the throne of the Walton estate. She didn't see the danger. She didn't see the way the doctor's jaw was set so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. She only saw a renowned specialist who was likely there to validate her own pregnancy as the superior alternative to Lorena's failure. Lorena, however, felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Dr. Smith had been Amira's primary specialist for years. He was the one who had run the tests, the one who had explained the complexities of her condition with a gentleness that was foreign in this house. She respected him. But she also knew that he was paid by the Waltons. In this world, loyalty was often a line item on a ledger. She feared that John had bought him off, that the man she trusted with her daughter's life was about to hand John the weapon he needed to strip her of her dignity completely. She backed away until her shoulders hit the bookshelves, making herself small, bracing for the impact of his words. But Dr. Smith did not smile. He did not take John's outstretched hand. He walked past the tycoon as if he were a piece of furniture, his gaze fixed on the center of the room. The rejection was so absolute, so public, that John was left with his hand hanging in the air, a foolish grin freezing on his face. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air grew thick with a static tension, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. The doctor walked straight to the desk, ignoring Emma completely, forcing her to scramble out of his way to avoid being brushed aside. He placed the leather case on the polished wood surface. The sound of the heavy bag hitting the desk was a dull thud that echoed like a gavel. He didn't open it immediately. He stood there, his hands resting on the brass latches, his head bowed slightly as if he were praying, or counting to 10 to keep from strangling someone. John's smile faltered. He cleared his throat, a nervous sound that betrayed his confusion. He tried to regain control of the scene. He asked the doctor, with a slightly sharper edge to his voice, what was so urgent that it required barging into a private family meeting. He tried to joke that unless the doctor had found a cure for broken genes, the meeting was over. He gestured to the signed papers, proudly displaying them as if they were a trophy. He told the doctor that the problem was being handled, that the defective element was being removed, and that he was free to focus his efforts on the new, healthy air that Emma was carrying. At the mention of the new air, Dr. Smith's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto John's face with a ferocity that made John take a stumbling step back. It wasn't the look of a doctor looking at a patient, it was the look of a judge looking at a condemned man. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't empty, it was full of unsaid things, screaming to be let out. Lorena watched, paralyzed. She had never seen Dr. Smith look like this. He was usually the picture of clinical detachment, a man of science who dealt in probabilities and proteins. Now, he looked like a man of vengeance. She saw his eyes dart to her, just for a second. The look wasn't one of pity, as she had expected. It was an apology. It was a look of profound, sorrowful respect. And in that split second, Lorena realized that whatever was in that briefcase, it wasn't a weapon against her. John, oblivious to the shifting tides, continued to dig his own grave. He mistook the doctor's silence for hesitation. He pushed harder. He demanded the files. He wanted to wave them in Lorena's face one last time before kicking her out. He ranted about the cost of Amira's care, about the embarrassment of having a child who would never run a company or attend a gala. He called Amira a sinking ship and claimed that he had a right to cut the anchor. He turned to Emma, placing a hand on her stomach, and boasted that finally, he would have a child made of pure, Walton stock, a child that proved his own genetic superiority. The doctor's hands tightened on the latches of the case. The sound of the metal clicking open was sharp and final. Click. Click. Dr. Smith lifted the lid of the case. The interior was sparse, containing only a single, thick file folder marked with a red, confidential, stamp and the seal of the National Genetic Registry. He didn't hand the file to John. He didn't hand it to Lorena. He pulled it out and held it against his chest, as if shielding it from the contamination of the room. He turned slowly to face John. The look of disgust on his face was so potent it was almost tangible. He looked at the man who had just signed away his family for the sake of his ego. He looked at the mistress who was preening over a pregnancy she claimed was a miracle. And then he looked at the signed divorce papers on the desk, the legal instrument of a lie. John, sensing that something was wrong but too arrogant to understand what, tried one last time to assert dominance. He barked at the doctor, demanding to know the meaning of this theater. He asked if the doctor had forgotten who paid his retainer. He asked if the doctor had forgotten who he was. Dr. Smith's voice, when he finally spoke, was low, calm, and terrifyingly steady. It was the voice of a man who held the power of God in his hands. He told John that he hadn't forgotten anything. In fact, he said, he was there because he remembered too much. He stated that he had spent the last 24 hours agonizing over the ethics of his profession, wrestling with the confidentiality agreements that bound him. But, he continued, watching John with cold eyes, there were some sins that dissolved ink and paper. There were some lies so egregious that to remain silent was to be complicit in a crime against nature. Lorena held her breath. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. The doctor was not there to deliver a diagnosis of the daughter. He was there to deliver an autopsy of the father. John's face went slack. The bluster began to drain out of him, replaced by the first creeping tendrils of genuine fear. He looked at the file in the doctor's hand, then at the doctor's face. He saw no deference there. He saw only the cold, hard impending impact of a truth he had spent a lifetime running from. Dr. Smith took a step forward, closing the distance between himself and the tycoon. He didn't look at the papers. He didn't look at the mistress. He looked straight into the void of John's eyes. The harbinger had arrived, and the message he carried was about to level the entire building. The silence stretched to its breaking point, a rubber band pulled until it snapped, leaving the room waiting for the one sentence that would change the world. The library had become a vacuum. The air, previously thick with the musk of old paper and John's suffocating arrogance, had been sucked out the moment Dr. Smith crossed the threshold. In its place was a stillness so absolute, so fragile, that the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like the countdown of a bomb. Lorena stood pressed against the bookshelves, her hands gripping the wood until her knuckles turned white, her breath shallow and held high in her chest. She was bracing for the final blow, the medical confirmation that would strip the last shred of dignity from her daughter's existence. She expected Dr. Smith to act as the executioner, wielding genetics like a blade to sever her from the Walton legacy once and for all. But the executioner was not looking at her. Dr. Alastair Smith stood before the mahogany desk, a monolith of moral outrage dressed in charcoal wool. He did not sit. He did not remove his coat. He did not offer the customary polite nod to the master of the house. His presence dominated the room, reducing the sprawling library to a claustrophobic interrogation cell. In his hands, the leather file folder seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a Pandora's box that he had carried through the city to this very spot. He placed it on the desk, not with a slam, but with a deliberate, terrifying gentleness. The soft thud of the file hitting the leather blotter was louder than a scream in the unnatural silence. John, however, was deaf to the frequency of the doctor's fury. Blinded by his own narrative of triumph, he saw only what he wanted to see, a renowned expert arriving just in time to validate his cruelty. He leaned back in his chair, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand, the ice chiming against the crystal. He gestured toward the file with a lazy, proprietorial wave, his smile a grease-slick smear across his face. He spoke to the doctor as if they were conspirators in a grand design, urging him to present the findings. He wanted the science. He wanted the charts and the diagrams that would prove, irrevocably, that Amira was a genetic dead end. He wanted to wave the paper in Lorena's face as she left, a final seal of approval on his decision to discard her for a better model. Beside him, Emma mirrored his confidence, though hers was brittle. She sat perched on the arm of his chair, her hand resting protectively over her flat stomach, the physical manifestation of the perfect air John was so desperate for. She looked at the doctor with a mixture of boredom and entitlement, waiting for him to congratulate them, to bless the new union, to confirm that she was the biological savior of the Walton line. Dr. Smith ignored them both. He didn't acknowledge John's request. He didn't look at the signed divorce papers that lay like a corpse between them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, putting them on with a slow, methodical precision that was agonizing to watch. He opened the file. There were no thick stacks of paper, no complex genetic maps of Amira's chromosomes. There was only a single, aged document, yellowed at the edges, bearing the letterhead of a hospital that had closed 20 years ago, and a more recent, crisp report stamped with yesterday's date. He looked up then, over the rim of his glasses. His eyes were not cold, they were burning. It was a gaze of such intense, concentrated disappointment that it should have set John on fire. He looked at the man who had spent years berating his wife for her failure. He looked at the man who had publicly humiliated his daughter for her disability. He looked at the man who was currently preening over a pregnancy he believed was his divine right. John's smile faltered, the corners twitching. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight. He prompted the doctor again, his voice losing its jovial edge, sharpening into a demand. He asked what the delay was. He asked for the verdict on the defective child. Dr. Smith closed the file. He didn't need to read it. He knew the contents by heart. He placed his hands flat on the desk, leaning forward until he was invading John's personal space, looming over the seated tycoon like a judgment tower. The verdict, Dr. Smith said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, has nothing to do with the child, John. The confusion on John's face was total. He blinked, opening his mouth to argue, but the doctor cut him off. Dr. Smith's voice rose, not in volume, but in intensity, a steel blade unsheathed in the quiet room. He gestured to the room, to Emma, to the divorce papers, and finally, to Lorena, who was watching with wide, terrified eyes. You have summoned me here to validate your cruelty, Dr. Smith continued, his enunciation crisp and devastating. You have built an entire existence on the premise that Lorena has failed you. You have paraded your mistress through this house as the bearer of your truth legacy. You have signed legal documents declaring your daughter a burden caused by inferior genetics. He paused, letting the words hang there, heavy and toxic. John's face began to redden, his temper flaring at the insubordination. He started to stand up, to shout, to order the doctor out of his house. But Dr. Smith delivered the sentence before John could fully rise. It is a medical marvel that you are blaming Lorena for defective genes, John, considering your private records you seem to have conveniently forgotten or ignored, prove that you have been clinically sterile since the age of 10. The sentence hit the room like a physical shockwave. It wasn't just a statement, it was a demolition. It shattered the air, the time, and the reality of everyone present. The world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. The grandfather clock continued to tick, but the sound was distant now, drowned out by the roaring silence that followed the revelation. John froze halfway out of his chair. His mouth was open, a retort dying on his tongue. He looked like a wax figure melting under intense heat. His brain, wired for arrogance and victory, simply could not process the data. Sterile. The word bounced around the library, ricocheting off the leather-bound books and the high ceilings. Clinically sterile. Since childhood. He sank back into his chair, not because he chose to, but because his legs gave out. The color drained from his face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. He stared at the doctor, his eyes wide and unseeing, searching for the punchline, for the mistake, for the just kidding. But Dr. Smith's face was granite. There was no humor there. Only the cold, hard weight of biological fact. Slowly, agonizingly, the implications began to crash into John's consciousness like a series of falling dominoes. If he was sterile, then he could not be the father of any child. His eyes darted to the divorce papers. He had just signed away his marriage based on the lie that Lorena couldn't give him a healthy heir. But if he was sterile, then Lorena's failure was a mathematical impossibility. Then, his gaze moved. It moved with the jerky, terrified motion of a trapped animal. It landed on Emma. Emma, who was still perched on the arm of the chair. Emma, whose hand was still resting on her stomach. Emma, who had just spent an hour mocking Lorena for being a failed incubator. The color had vanished from Emma's face as well. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Her hand snatched away from her stomach as if the skin burned. She looked at Dr. Smith, then at John, her eyes wide with a panic that was absolute and primal. The smugness was gone, replaced by the terrified realization that her safety net had just been set on fire. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, to spin a new web, but no sound came out. The truth was too blunt, too scientific to be charmed away. John looked at her stomach. The air. The son he had bragged about to his father. The future of the Walton dynasty. If he was sterile, who was the father of the baby Emma was carrying? The realization hit him with the force of a sledgehammer to the chest. He wasn't the patriarch restarting his dynasty. He was the cuckold. He was the fool. He was the punchline to a joke the entire city would soon be laughing at. He had destroyed his family, humiliated his wife, and disowned the child he raised, all for a baby that belonged to another man. A sound escaped John's throat, a strangled, wet gasp that sounded like a drowning man breaking the surface. He looked at Dr. Smith again, pleading silently for it to be a lie. Dr. Smith simply tapped the file with his index finger. The mumps, John. Severe orchitis complicated by trauma from your riding accident. Your father knew. The specialists knew. You were told, though perhaps you were too young or too arrogant to listen. Your sperm count is 0. It has always been 0. It will always be 0. The doctor turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on Emma with a look of withering contempt. So, I must ask, simply as a man of science, whose legacy is currently residing in that womb? Because it is certainly not a Walton. John turned to Emma. The veins in his neck bulged. The glass in his hand shattered, crushed by a sudden, violent spasm of his grip. Amber liquid and blood dripped onto the divorce papers, staining the signatures, blurring the lines of the contract he had so eagerly signed. Lorena, watching from the shadows of the bookshelf, felt her knees weaken. She slid down the wood until she hit the floor. She didn't faint, but the world tilted. The monster that had been hunting her was dead. He hadn't been killed by a sword or a gun. He had been killed by the truth. She looked at John, who was now trembling, a visible vibration that shook his entire frame. The mockery was gone. The laughter was gone. In the silence of the library, the only sound was the dripping of whiskey and blood onto the floor, and the jagged, terrified breathing of a man whose entire universe had just collapsed under the weight of one single sentence. The king was naked. And the exile watching from the corner realized, with a dawn of horror and vindication, that the war was over. The sound of the crystal tumbler crushing within John's grip was not merely the breaking of glass, it was the audible fracture of a man's reality. Shards of expensive crystal dug into his palm, but the physical pain was distant, a dull throb compared to the evisceration of his ego that was taking place in real time. A mixture of aged single malt and bright red blood dripped from his clenched fist, spattering onto the pristine divorce papers on the desk. The dark liquid pooled over his signature, blotting out his name, a symbolic erasure that no lawyer could have drafted. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was suspended in a state of suspended animation. John stared at Dr. Smith, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for a trace of deception in the doctor's stone-cold expression. He wanted to scream that it was a lie, a medical mistake, a clerical error from a hospital archives department. But deep down, in the pit of his stomach where the truth always lives before the mind acknowledges it, John knew. He remembered the childhood illness, the weeks of fever, the hushed conversations between his father and the specialists that stopped abruptly whenever he entered the room. He had suppressed it, buried it under layers of bravado and entitlement, rewriting his own history to fit the narrative of the virile, conquering patriarch. But biology does not care for narratives. Slowly, mechanically, John turned his head. His neck cracked with the tension. He didn't look at Lorena, who was still pressed against the bookshelf like a ghost haunting the scene. He looked at Emma. Emma was no longer the smug, victorious queen who had taunted Lorena only moments before. She had scrambled off the arm of the chair, backing away until she hit the edge of the heavy velvet drapes. Her face, usually a mask of immaculate makeup and calculated expressions, was rapidly losing its structure. The color had drained away, leaving her patchy and gray. Her hand, which had been resting so proudly on her stomach, the vessel of the golden air, now clutched her throat as if she were strangling on her own secrets. The silence broke not with a shout, but with a whisper. John asked her a single question, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. He asked her who it was. The question was simple, but the weight of it was crushing. If he was sterile, and had been for 30 years, then the life growing inside her was an impossibility. It was a biological contradiction that could only be resolved by one answer: betrayal. Emma tried to laugh. It was a terrible, jagged sound, high-pitched and hysterical. She tried to deploy her usual arsenal of gaslighting and charm. She stammered that the doctor was lying, that he was a senile old fool trying to sabotage their happiness. She reached out toward John, her fingers trembling, pleading with him not to listen to poison. She called Dr. Smith a hired gun, accusing Lorena of paying him off to ruin their moment. It was a desperate, flailing defense, the thrashing of a drowning swimmer pulling everyone down with her. But John was not listening to the words, he was watching her eyes. He saw the terror there. He saw the way her gaze darted to the door, calculating an exit strategy. He saw the truth written in the dilation of her pupils. She knew. She had always known. John lunged. It wasn't a graceful movement, it was the clumsy, violent lurch of a wounded animal. He didn't strike her, but he slammed his bloodied hand onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He roared at her, a primal sound of rage that shook the window panes. He demanded the truth, stripping away the veneer of civility that usually governed the Walton household. He screamed that he had thrown his wife and child into the street for her. He had humiliated the mother of the child he raised for this promise of a new legacy. He demanded to know whose bastard he was planning to name as the heir to the Walton empire. Emma's facade shattered completely. The elegance vanished. The poise evaporated. Under the pressure of John's fury and the doctor's silent, condemning gaze, she crumbled. She sank to her knees, not in a gesture of repentance, but because her legs simply gave out. She began to sob, ugly, heaving sobs that smeared her mascara down her cheeks in black rivulets. The confession, when it came, was not an apology. It was an accusation. She screamed back at him, her voice shrill and desperate. She admitted it. Yes, she was pregnant. Yes, she had ensured the test would be positive. But she didn't do it out of love for another man, she did it because John was useless. The words hung in the air, toxic and irreversible. Emma, cornered and terrified of losing the fortune she had worked so hard to secure, lashed out. She revealed the grotesque mechanics of her deception. She told him that she knew he was desperate for an heir. She knew that without a pregnancy, her position as the new Mrs. Walton was tenuous. She had tried, she claimed, to conceive with him for months during their affair, but nothing happened. She sensed the defect in him before the doctor ever said a word. So, she took matters into her own hands. She confessed to going to a high-end club in the city, a place where anonymity was currency. She admitted to picking a man who looked enough like John, tall, dark hair, broad shoulders, to pass the initial scrutiny. She described it not as an affair of passion, but as a business transaction, a necessary investment to secure the ring. She claimed she did it for them. She twisted the knife, shouting that she was trying to give him the one thing he couldn't give himself, that she was trying to save his ego by providing the heir he was so pathetic to crave. John stood frozen, the blood dripping from his hand forgotten. The humiliation was total. He wasn't just a victim of infidelity, he was the architect of his own destruction. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that the woman groveling on the floor didn't love him. She didn't even respect him. She saw him as a meal ticket, a sterile host body to be parasitized. The perfect heir he had bragged about to his father, the child he was building a new wing of the house for, was the product of a random encounter with a stranger, conceived solely to trap him into a marriage. He looked at the signed divorce papers again. The ink was barely dry. He had just legally severed ties with Lorena, a woman who had stood by him for 6 years, who had endured his abuse, his neglect, and his scorn, for a fraud. He had laughed at Lorena. He had thrown the papers at her feet. He had called her a failed incubator. And all the while, he was the one who was broken. He was the one who was empty. The irony was so sharp it felt like it was cutting his throat. Dr. Smith watched the scene with a grim satisfaction. He didn't intervene. He let the poison drain out of the wound. He watched as John turned away from Emma, unable to look at her any longer. John's shoulders slumped, the arrogant posture of the tycoon replaced by the curvature of a defeated old man. He looked at his father's portrait hanging above the fireplace, the stern, judgmental eyes of the patriarch who demanded perfection. John realized he would have to explain this. He would have to tell his father that the new era of the Walton family was a lie. He would have to explain to the press, to the board, to the world, that he had been duped in the most public, shameful way possible. Emma, seeing that her defense had failed, tried a new tactic. She crawled toward him, reaching for his leg, begging. She promised they could fix it. She promised they could keep it a secret. She told him that no one had to know, that they could raise the child as a Walton, that perception was reality. She was bargaining with the truth, trying to sell him a lie he could no longer afford to buy. John kicked her away. It wasn't a violent kick, but a dismissive one, like shaking off a dog. He looked at her with pure revulsion. The spell was broken. The trophy was tarnished beyond repair. He told her to get out. His voice was quiet, hollow. He didn't scream this time. He just told her to leave, to take her lies and her stranger's baby and vanish. Emma scrambled up, clutching her purse, realizing that the game was truly over. She looked at Lorena one last time, her eyes filled with a venomous envy. She had played the Game of Thrones and lost to a woman who hadn't even made a move. She fled the room, the sound of her heels clicking on the hardwood floor a frantic staccato retreat, leaving the heavy doors open behind her. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a battlefield after the slaughter. John leaned heavily against the desk, his head hanging low. He looked at the doctor, then, finally, he looked at Lorena. Lorena hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She had watched the woman who tried to steal her life destroy herself. She saw John for what he was, not a king, not a monster, but a small, broken man standing in the ruins of his own vanity. She saw the fear in his eyes as he looked at her. He was realizing the second half of the equation. If he was sterile, and Emma's child was not his. His gaze drifted to the divorce papers, specifically to the clause regarding custody of Amira. He looked at Lorena, his eyes widening with a new, dawning horror. He was doing the math. If he had been sterile since childhood, then Amira couldn't be his either. But unlike Emma's child, Amira existed. She was there. She had his name. And for 5 years, Lorena had let him believe she was his, despite the medical impossibility. John's mouth opened, a question forming on his lips, but the fear of the answer choked him. He had just cast aside a fraudulent air, only to realize he had spent 5 years rejecting a child whose origin was suddenly a terrifying mystery. The humiliation of Emma was bad, but the mystery of Amira was a looming abyss. He looked at Dr. Smith, then at Lorena, realizing that the doctor hadn't just come to expose Emma. He had come to reveal everything. And the look on Lorena's face, calm, cold, and utterly unafraid, told him that the worst was yet to come. The mask had fallen, but the sword was still hanging over his head. The silence that followed Emma's disgraceful exit was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The library door hung ajar, a gaping mouth that had just spat out the last of John's illusions. He stood by the desk, his hands still throbbing, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The room felt smaller now, the walls lined with the leather-bound history of the Walton family closing in on him. He looked at the divorce papers, stained with whiskey and his own blood, and then slowly, terrified, he lifted his eyes to Lorena. She was still standing by the bookshelf, a statue of quiet resilience. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't screamed. She simply watched him with an expression that was no longer fearful, but profoundly, devastatingly pitying. John's mind was a frantic kaleidoscope of shattered pride. The revelation of his sterility had severed his connection to the future he thought he was building with Emma. But as the shock began to recede, a darker, colder realization took root. If he had been sterile since childhood, then Amira, the 5-year-old girl upstairs, the child he had spent half a decade ignoring, mocking, and finally disowning, could not be his daughter. A twisted, ugly laugh bubbled up in his throat. He turned to Dr. Smith, his eyes wild. "So," he rasped, his voice trembling with a mix of hysteria and rage. "It seems I am surrounded by liars. Emma was a whore. And Lorena." He sneered, pointing a shaking finger at his wife. "You're no better, are you? You let me raise another man's bastard for 5 years. You let me feed her, house her, pay for her crippled existence." He took a step toward Lorena, his face twisting into a mask of disgust. "Who was it, Lorena? Who did you spread your legs for while I was at work? The driver? The gardener? Is that why the girl is broken? Did you mix my prestigious name with the gutter trash of this city?" Lorena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "Sit down, John," Dr. Smith's voice cut through the air like a whip. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. John stopped, stunned by the authority in the doctor's tone. Dr. Smith walked around the desk, placing himself physically between John and Lorena. He picked up the file again, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at John with anger anymore, he looked at him with the clinical detachment of a coroner examining a corpse. "You are a small man, John," Dr. Smith said quietly. "You project your own moral bankruptcy onto everyone around you. You assume Lorena is like Emma because you cannot conceive of a world where a woman acts out of love, honor, or sacrifice." "Love?" John scoffed, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "She cheated on me. She passed off a stranger's child as a Walton." "She saved you," Dr. Smith corrected, his voice hardening. "6 years ago, Lorena came to me. She had found your childhood medical records in the attic, the ones your father tried to burn. She knew you were sterile. She knew you would never be able to give her a child. But she also knew that your entire identity, your fragile ego, was wrapped up in the idea of your own virility. She knew that if you found out the truth, it would destroy you." John stared at Lorena. She held his gaze, her chin lifted. "I wanted you to be a father, John," she whispered, her voice steady. "I wanted us to be a family. I thought if I gave you a child, the biology wouldn't matter. I thought you would love her because she was ours." Dr. Smith opened the file to a specific page, a document sealed with a gold emblem that John didn't recognize. Lorena underwent a private, anonymous IVF procedure. It was done with the utmost discretion to protect your reputation. She endured the injections, the hormones, the surgery, all in secret, all to give you the heir you so desperately wanted without shattering your pride. John leaned against the desk, his legs weak. "So she is a bastard," he muttered, trying to salvage some shred of superiority. "A test tube baby from some random donor bank. Probably some desperate student needing cash." Dr. Smith looked at him over the rim of his glasses, a glint of steel in his eyes. "You really have no idea what you have thrown away, do you?